He probed the exposed circuitry with a diagnostic scanner in search of the problem. Captain Solo was working down inside one of the engine vents on the rear upper hull when he heard a loud Wookiee growl echoing off the surrounding hills as his co-pilot lost his patience with the job he was working on down beneath the ship. Solo stood up into the bright sunlight, squinting and grinning broadly at the familiar, frustrated growl of his friend, and laughed to himself. He bent back down inside and sprayed lubricant on the louvered heat dispersing veins under his feet. He reached down and worked the vein back and forth with his hands until it moved freely. In his mind he pictured his frustrated first mate. Laughing a bit to himself again at the thought of the irritated Wookiee, he climbed out of the open vent wiping a thick, dark fluid from his hands with a red rag before throwing it down on the metal skin of his ship. As he replaced the gridded vent cover he yelled out, loud enough to be heard below. "Relax, Chewie. I'll be right down and give you a hand, ******. I watched as wave after wave of sand in this barren dune sea washed silently beneath the low-flying dropship. As our search wore on, there was no escaping the smell of our animal passengers in the cramped cargo area. ETZ called out as he spotted a cascade of bones from a large beast stretched out over a ridgeline beneath us. "Hey, check that out," Felth stood, looking out the gunner's viewport. I leaned forward and nodded as I looked out. 0600 poured the sand from his boots into a small pyramid on the deck. "That's the bones of a crate dragon. They usually found in the rockier parts in mountain caves, but they come here, to the dunes to die. Banthas do the same thing. Somewhere out here there's a bantha graveyard full of bones. Sometimes the older local kids used to skip classes and waste the day out here looking for it. Although we had been sweeping for hours, the scanners had not picked up any droid signatures yet. It was late in the day, and the twin suns were sliding toward the horizon when 0600 spotted tracks in the sand beneath us. The pilot circled back around and dropped down closer to the surface to check them out. He set us down beside the tracks and released the door mechanism. We exited down the rear ramp into the sand to check out what 0600 had seen from the air. Rogue and I knelt, examining the depth of the tracks as Falker looked off toward the hills in the distance. The tracks were definitely not from any organic creature. They were made by something large, and with great weight bearing down on a mechanical drive system, no repulsor field for this vehicle. Perhaps these were the tracks of the elusive sandcrawler. Topoliv was crouched momentarily, also examining the tracks. He stood, following them with his eyes. They headed in a straight line toward the sharp, upward thrust range of sand-swept stone mountains that Falker was staring at. "They heading off that way, toward those hills in the distance," Dans and Falker agreed. "Let us go." We boarded the ship, dusted off quickly and raced toward the stony mountains, following the tracks. We sat down near the base of the hills, and once again we all filed out the back, leaving the animals behind to eat on large bales of food, and the doors open wide to help ventilate the hold and relieve the smell. There were small foot tracks, many appearing among the larger, vehicular tracks, and then fanning out, leading up into the hills following several paths. These may very well have been Jawa tracks. TDO-324 and a couple of other troopers from Tyrell's flight crew walked off on their own, following one trail of tracks up the sharp embankment of a ravine. We followed a snaking trail of the small tracks up into the hills as we drew our blasters, powered them on and holding them at the ready. There was no telling what might be found among the rocks ahead. TDO-324 and a couple of other troopers from Tyrell's flight crew walked off in another direction, following a branching trail of tracks up the sharp embankment of a ravine. We were about halfway up the coarse embankment, scanning for life when I heard the same throaty cry I had heard howling on the wind outside the cantina. It was joined by a chorus of several other howls and wails and grunting followed by a horrible scream and a discharged E-11 blast, then several other quick blaster discharges followed by silence. My group turned and doubled back, quickly scrambling in the direction of the noise. We came over a sandy rise and saw a robed, grunting creature with a disfigured head stooping over TDO-324, rummaging through the Improvium utility belt at his waist. There were 3 dead troopers lying scattered behind it and several other creatures were racing away further up the hill on foot. As we appeared, the creature rose. Turning toward us. standing tall and thrusting a meter-long metal club over its head and letting out an even louder war cry. We could now see that the head was not misshapen or disfigured, it was wrapped with bandages. It had a breather opening at the mouth and metal portals where the eyes should have been. Metal spikes were randomly thrust out of the bandages on its head, giving it an even more fierce appearance. The head wraps and loosely draped garments were a primitive form of desert survival, protection from the sands and winds in this wasteland. It was shaking the club back and forth over its head as it wailed and snarled from beneath the head wrappings. One end of the weapon was curved into a blunt, round club head with a sharp center spike. The other end tapered into a spike surrounded by sharp, bladed fins. This end was covered in the blood of the impaled trooper lying at the creature's feet. We all froze for just a second. Not quite sure what to make of this thing. It was 0600 that reacted first, lowering his blaster rifle and blowing a gaping hole through the chest of the wailing desert nomad. It fell to the sand in a heap, dropping the club as smoke curled away from the wound imposed by the sudden burst of energy from the heavy rifle. We walked closer to get a better look. I raised my eyes and blaster, scanning the cliffs around us, in case the others were watching, waiting for a chance to attack the rest of us. There did not appear to be any that I could see. This trooper and the others were dead, as was the creature. Tusken Raider, said 0600. Kicking the twitching leg of the body lying in the sand. The locals also call them sandpeople. These things are not to be messed with, he said as he walked over to the discarded weapon and picked up the dropped gaffi stick. He turned the war club over in his hands as he slowly walked a bit further up to the plateau at the top of the hill. Check this out, guys, he called back down to us as his eyes swept across the rocks. We walked up to the top of the ravine and he pointed across the flat mesa to a cave in the face of the wall just ahead. I bet we find the others in his raiding party, or maybe a fugitive droid in there, he said. Pointing to a small opening in the rocks. Rogue and the others circled around a large rock and moved in closer to the cave to get a better look. 0600 was looking over the heavy club as I walked past to join the search group. I think I'm gonna hang on to this, he said. You never know when it might come in handy, I nodded in agreement. Nice little trophy too. He walked after me toward the cave. 4120. 1344. Dans. ETZ and I entered the cave as Rogue. 0600 and Tupolev covered us, watching the cliffs surrounding the plateau. Confident there were no Tuskens to our rear, they followed us inside, leaving Taka to guard the entrance. Our infrared bucket imaging systems flickered on in the darkness of the cave. It smelled of death in here. The remains of several small desert animals lay on a small rock inside, most had been slaughtered and eaten, but what pieces remained permeated the room with a foul smell. Tupolev found several clubs resting against the cave wall as we advanced. Those are mine when we head out, he said, pointing to the gaffi sticks. Dans picked up a small mechanical device off the floor of the cave, and shrugged. I can't be sure, but it looks like a calibration tool of some kind. I bet they bought it from our Jawas. We spread out as the narrow entrance room expanded into a darker, larger cavern with craggy stalactites hanging from the ceiling. A few shabby blankets were wound into sleeping nests on the uneven ground in the darker areas near the walls. Rogue went to examine them as ETZ happened to look up at a sudden movement among the rocks overhead just in time to see a Tusken dropping down howling, its bladed gaffi pointed straight down for the kill. Instead of being stabbed through his neck and down into his chest. The blade struck him on his protective shoulder armor and glanced off, knocking him to the ground. Another creature jumped on Dans, who swiveled away and cracked the creature square in the face with the butt of his rifle, driving the metal eyepieces back into the skull beneath the wraps. In the ensuing confusion, I was knocked to the floor from behind by the blunt end of a gaffi in my back. My bucket flew off and rolled aside as the creature jumped over me wielding the club and howling. ETZ blew a hole through the Tusken on top of him and rolled over. Taking aim at the one just struck by Dans, but Falker beat him and Tupolev to it, blasting a smoking hole through the bandaged neck of the beast. 0600 turned abruptly at the waist. Jamming the gaffi stick he held firmly through the chest of the Tusken charging him as Tupolev blasted it. 4120 took aim at the creature struggling with me but cool DNT get a clear shot. I kicked the feet out from under the robed Tusken standing over me and rolled to my feet as the creature rose up, flailing its stick at me in wide arcs, cutting through the air just in front of me. I jerked my head back out of the way to avoid being struck, but was a second too late, as the sharpened spike on the tip of the weapon sliced through the skin on my brow. As the sharp tip flew by again, I reached up, grabbed the Tusken by the neck, jammed the muzzle of my blaster in the flailing creature's mouth and quickly pulled the trigger. I saw a bright red flash in the eyepieces, and the limp Tusken corpse dropped to the cave floor. I spun back to the others with my blaster held out, squinting to see in the dim light. They had their blasters pointing my way. When they realized it was me, they quickly holstered them. I bent down and picked up my bucket, putting my gloved hand to my forehead. When I pulled it away, blood covered the palm and dripped freely from my sliced head. We turned back toward the entrance of the cave and walked past Taka back out into the light of the day. I wiped the blood from my face and eyes, and pressed hard against the slice wound as I took a seat on the small rock just outside. Topaliv came out behind Dan's carrying an armful of the deadly spiked metal clubs. "There's one here for each of us, if you want them." I opened several of the belt compartments on my utility belt searching for bandages. The first had reinforced cord and a small grappling hook, the second a small concussion charges. Finally I found the right one with several small packages of bandages and a topical Bacta spray. Topaliv dropped a gaffy beside me. ETZ and 0600 walked past me as I squeezed my split skin together and stretched the Bacta-coated bandage in place, pressing it down hard. I looked up. "Hey, is your shoulder okay?" He looked back. "Yeah, it's fine. I was lucky. How's the head?" "I'll live." 0600 walked around the corner and called back to us. I thought this was where we were. Behold, gentlemen, the ruins of the first Bomar monk temple on Tatooine. It was a small ruined pile of stone. I stood up and we all walked over for a closer look. The Bomar built this small shrine as a gathering point to meditate in the tranquility of the desert after the crash of their starship. "Right over there," he said, pointing to another of the sandy peaks. The shifting sands over the centuries had all but buried the remnants of the Bomar vessel, but the main drive thrusters could still be seen protruding from the cliffside. The first Bomar had a temple here. This small shrine was just the top of a network of tunnels and caverns inside these jagged hills, but that, gentlemen, is a story and excursion into the desert for another time, and he walked away from the small crumbling building. The monks built a much more heavily fortified palace further out in the Dune Sea before they began shedding their bodies. We may pass near it later if we continue on our previous course. "Excuse me, did you say shedding their bodies?" asked ETZ, rubbing his shoulder. 0600 grinned wide beneath his bucket. "That's right. After the palace was completed, the monks all underwent a procedure that removed their brains from their bodies, and placed it into a life-supporting nutrient-rich liquid in clear jars. They felt if they were free from the restraints of the physical body, their meditations would take them deeper into understanding the universe. There's a small army of spider walker droids in the palace. They remove the jars from the central meditation chamber when a monk has the desire to move about." ETZ said nothing more. I stood up, holding my head. These sandpeople must have bought that calibrator from the Jawas. Those crawler tracks were recent. We need to be looking for Jawas, and their sandcrawler. They must have picked up our wandering droid. I walked to the edge of the plateau and looked down into the vast valley stretching out before me. Tattoo I had just sunk beneath the mountains on the horizon, and Tattoo 2 was not far behind. The landscape in this direction was brutal. Sandcrawler or not, they didn't go this way. 0600 nodded his bucket in agreement with me. "You're right about that. Even a crawler wouldn't make it through that. We need to head back to the ship and set our sensors for a Jawa sandcrawler. That should be a little easier to find than a half-buried escape pod or a lost droid, *. The ride was fairly smooth as we raced the Sentinel across the sands in search of the large mechanized transport of the Jawas. The second of the twin suns was almost setting as we raced through a pass in the low hills. 0600 sat forward. "There's the palace." We all looked out the gunner's port as we moved past the massive structure. ETZ sat back uneasily, contemplating the dismembered brains walking about inside. 0600 spoke under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. "They're not the only tenants anymore. As our ship disappeared toward the horizon, an occupant emerged from another ship that had landed just outside the monk's palace. He stepped off the extended ramp into the sand, the heat baking his Mandalorian armor. There was a job to be done. He had been called in to help collect from a smuggler, by one of the palace's newer tenants. Jabba the Hutt. *****. The second of the two suns was disappearing beneath the horizon as Captain Solo snapped the last piece of the targeting system back in place under the long barrels of the upper quad-gun array. "It's getting dark, let us finish this up. We can stay here tonight and head back to the spaceport in the morning. I want to take a quick inventory of the cache, and I have more work to do inside anyway." The Wookiee barked a response as he reconnected the power couplings and cycled through a synchronization process on the gun. When it finished, he slipped into the adjacent gunner's chair and grabbed the controls. The small display monitor before him flickered to life as the guns rose on the outside of the ship, mimicking his movements. He howled again, appearing satisfied. Outside the window, Solo stood up and stepped away from the swiveling guns, heading for the top hatch. Tattoo 2 had settled just below the horizon and it was almost dark when we dropped over a ridge and came across what we had been searching for. There, just ahead, stopped for the night, with a camp made and fires blazing, was not one, but two of the massive sandcrawlers. Our pilot rolled toward them and sat down just outside their camp. We could see the little creatures scurrying around their huge vehicle as we disembarked. As we walked away from the Sentinel and drew closer to the crawler, we could see many of the little creatures hiding behind the massive treads of their vehicle, watching us closely to see what we would do. One Jawa warily left his hiding place and walked slowly over to us with his arm outstretched, as if to welcome us. He jabbered several small phrases before 0600 could switch on his bucket translator. A series of small whistles issued from his helmet as it scanned the translation algorithms trying to convert to speech. Then he nodded his head. "I've got it. It's a little broken, must be the local dialect, but I think I can translate it." 0600 spoke to the little creature, and his bucket emitted a series of garbled messages, converted to the Jawa language. "We are looking for a droid that you may have found wandering in the desert. It probably looks like us, with two legs." The small, brown-robed creature seemed to think a moment and then respond. "Many droids and scrap we have, from the wastes, but no recoveries of any that stand and walk as you do. I check with the others," and he turned and ran toward the front tread on the looming crawler. Rogue instinctively raised his rifle at the quick movement, but 0600 waved a hand. "It's okay, he's just going to see if any of the others know anything. He says they have many droids. Some collected from the wastelands, but they haven't picked up any bipeds." Several other Jawas poked their heads around the side of the vehicle and joined the messenger, yellow eyes glowing brightly in the dim twilight. They all turned their backs to us and began to jabber among themselves, but turned around several times to check on us. When the small band had finished discussing the droids, the little leader returned to us, saying that the driver of the other crawler had not recovered any bipeds either, but noted that there was at least one other crawler out in the Dune Sea that may have. 0600 thanked the little creature and stood up to face Rogue. "They don't know anything about a biped droid. We surprised them. They're pretty shaken. He would have told us." We all lowered our blasters and filed back on board the drop ship. "Back to square one," said 4120 as he sat down in his jump seat. "Yup," replied Blade. The little Jawa scratched his head, watching as our drop ship lifted off into the bright, fiery orange of the dying daylight. He wondered if perhaps any of us might possibly have been interested in the little blue astromech the other, third crawler out in the dunes had recovered among the rocky canyons at the edge of the wastes. Chapter 8. Interrogations. We continued on, sweeping the seemingly endless rolling fields of sand for the missing sandcrawler, until the last of the day's light had faded away. Although our instruments could continue picking up signals, we were exhausted beyond reading them. We sat down at the base of a rocky outcropping along the edge of the Dune Sea, near the Junland wastes. The livestock was offloaded and tethered to the side of the ship, left to graze on large bales of food brought from the cargo area. Temperatures were beginning to drop without the warmth of the sun's overhead. So we took several of the compressed food bales and set them afire just outside the rear of the ship. The first shift guard was in place, scanning the area with his thermal imaging so the rest of us could get some sleep. We gathered around the blaze and settled in for the night. Dan's propped himself up on one elbow, the firelight throwing flickering light and shadow across his armor as he looked over to Blade. "So what was that all about back up on the Devastator? Who was that up on the gantry?" We all turned to face Blade, curious to hear. ETZ asked. "What are you talking about?" Dan sat up fully. "Back up on the Devastator, just as we were about to leave. I was strapped in near the rear hatch and Blade here was boarding. He was talking to Deckard and 4120 when I saw him look up to a dark figure on an overhead access gantry. Whoever it was raised a hand, then turned and disappeared into the shadows as we lifted off." "So who was it?" Blade, D-Drag looked over at Taka, who looked over to Falker and Rogue, then they all turned toward Blade. He stared silently into the fire for a few moments, then drew in a breath and began his story. "I am a third-generation soldier. I am very proud of our service history and have worked hard to live up to my family's expectations. My father's position has been both a blessing and a curse for me though. He always wanted me to stand in his footsteps one day on the bridge of a cruiser, but I just never considered myself Navy material. My determination to not let family ties influence my path as a soldier has, in some regard, been my undoing." 1265 paced back and forth, scanning the darkened dunes, blaster drawn and at the ready, but kept an ear open as we all listened closely to Blade over the sound of the wind. "My goal from as far back as I can remember was to join the Imperial Guard. My thoughts take me back to when, as a boy, I visited my father on his ship. On that rare occasion I remember standing in fear and awe as special visitors came aboard. I caught only glimpses of the dignitaries with their long red-robed protectors with the gleaming, faceless red helmets. I could feel their intimidating glares and stern disposition, even from beneath their expressionless armor. Only the best, the toughest, most dedicated were permitted among their ranks. From that day on I knew my destiny, or so I thought." One of the dewbacks groaned as he continued. "Many early years of training and preparation yielded my placement near the top of my class coming out of the academy. 2 seasons later I was with a chosen few selected to continue my training with the Guard themselves. My father was proud even though I know in his heart he had wanted a different outcome for me. For several months members of my squad had butted heads with one of the other trainees who had been installed as our squad leader and superior. He was the son of a well-known politician. His position in Guard training had been maneuvered and bought. The father was well known for his unscrupulous tactics for pushing agendas through the Senate. My father had served with him, and knew the full extent of his corruption." Blade looked around the fire into our eyes as we listened. Some eyes were on him. Some on the fire, some off into the stars. My father knew him well. They had clashed many times, and as time progressed, my father advanced, whereas the politician to be eventually wound up a little further down in the ranks. There was an altercation one night with several women in a local club, and the other man was dismissed from service. He wasted no time moving into politics, using his contacts, blackmailing anyone and everyone he had information on to move himself ahead. On numerous occasions the others in the unit, and I myself, had similar problems with his son. We had to correct him on matters of procedure and protocol and continually pick up his slack both physically and mentally. My father warned me to watch him, and he was right. Our training group decided it would be a solid testimony to us all if we made it through under his leadership, or lack thereof. Eventually he would fall by the wayside. We just had to keep training and following his commands, but doing it faster and better than he could. He let it go with everyone but me. 0600 slid his pack off and sat down on an empty equipment crate near the entry ramp and spit into the darkness. The flames of the fire flickered in the light breeze as Blade continued. He was on me constantly, riding me harder and harder right up until our last furlough. It was just before our sequestered training began, separated from the general populace on Kurita. It was late in the evening, and I had been finishing up a squad report, that he was supposed to have filed, before I headed out. The group was out for a night of drinking before our strict regimen of clean body, clean mind became a way of life. Most of my squadmates had been drinking for hours and were halfway down the row of pubs in the bottom by the time I arrived. Our superior had apparently enjoyed one too many and was busy spouting off at the mouth about me when I arrived. I moved to the bar, ignoring him. I stood there with quiet rage, drinking my drink as he belligerently berated me and mocked my exemplary performance. I would not let him get the better of me, not this close, not now. I was determined to keep it together. I successfully kept my anger in check until my family's loyalty to the Empire was questioned. I didn't make a move, or strike out at him. I just wryly smiled back at him as I took another sip of my drink. My apparent amusement enraged him. He wanted so badly for me to hit him and start something. The drink had gotten the better of his senses and he finally swung his drink container at me, shattering it against my head. There was a brief scuffle in the back of the tavern in which I gave him the beating he had long deserved. Somewhere along the way he tripped in his drunken stupor and fell backward into the bar, snapping his neck just below the base of his skull. My fate and future was sealed before his lifeless body hit the floor. There was a moment's silence as he paused, trying to think of how best to proceed. It's hard to explain how it feels to have everything you have worked so hard to accomplish just vanish, gone in an instant. I was eventually acquitted based on the testimony of my squad mates and the other bar patrons. It was clearly self-defense, but all my life I had wanted one thing. I had spent years preparing my mind and body. I was so close to what I wanted and it would never happen. I thought surely the guard would want someone who stood up for their beliefs, especially when defending the reputation of the Empire, but I guess the death of his son was more than the twisted politician would allow. I am certain he used his influence to make sure the door to the guard was closed to me forever. After the publicity of the trial dies down, my father asked that I not contact him unless I was in danger. Although his request was not in anger, we haven't spoken in almost 10 standard years. We don't really have to though. He knows what the fight was about, and he is proud of me, but he also knows that if anyone ever thought he was using his influence on my behalf, it could be taken the wrong way by the wrong people. Distance was best. I was assigned to desert training on Dantawan, but with the decreasing demand for that specialty. I was moved again and cross-trained as an at-Saint pilot. While working my way up to ADET commander, I was strangely and quickly reassigned. In the middle of the night I was unceremoniously awakened, and told to leave everything behind. A cloaked figure escorted me to a remote hangar telling me that my belongings would follow shortly. Papers had been prepared and orders processed for my transfer back into a stormtrooper position. I found myself strapping on my armor once again, shipping out to a remote building site to oversee and protect a group of structural engineers and an encampment of Wookiee slaves working on a top clearance-only project. It was later that season that I earned my call sign. 2 slaves broke their shackles and in seconds had overpowered 3 troopers, killing the first 2. It's amazing how fast those big creatures can move when they re-motivated. The smaller one grabbed my XO but received a headshot from one of my squadmates for his trouble. The other lunged for me but I literally cut him in half with blasts from my 15. The boss called me Blade after that and the name stuck. It was the first time I had lost friends in combat. Unfortunately, it would not be the last. With the engineers' work on the outpost nearly completed, I was awakened once again in the middle of the night and told to leave at once. It was the cloaked figure as before. My room had been emptied while I slept and my things already loaded for the abrupt reassignment. This time the destination was the SSD Devastator. There I would catch a shuttle to my new unit and pick up extra gear for the next assignment. Our long final approach was extended due to the seizure of a hostile ship in the main hangar bay. Various craft circled to other access points on the massive vessel. Small flashes of light illuminated from beneath the destroyer, but our holding pattern kept us from a direct view of the incident. Our shuttle was finally cleared to approach a small service bay under the bridge. As we touched down, various personnel went about their tasks, business as usual. Whatever was taking place on the other side of the ship was literally of no consequence here. I worked my way through the endless maze of halls and corridors down through the core of the destroyer to a central turbolift cluster. After a long descent,